Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And we have yet another returning guest, one of our absolute favorites who needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. Anthony Miller. How are you tonight, Anthony?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing great this evening. I'm coming to you from Billings, Montana, the land up north.
The land up north. We love that. Yeah. So the reason that Anthony is with us tonight, we've been trying to put this together for a little while. All of our schedules have been pretty hectic. But I came across a post that Anthony had made about probably a month ago or so. I found it so fascinating. And then I saw that many other people were reposting it. I saw it on all kinds of different platforms. And I thought this is really sparking something, whether people agreed with it or didn't agree with it, or just most of them just wanted to dive in more and learn more. So I thought, let's just have Anthony on Mormonish and let's talk about that post and the information in it. And so he was gracious enough to agree and to put together some slides for us. And I think you guys are really going to be fascinated with this topic. And I think you're going to find it extremely interesting. We'll let Anthony just very quickly introduce himself and the topic, because this is it. This is going to be great.
Thank you so much. I went through my faith crisis 8.5 years ago on August 29th of 2016 is when I stumbled across the Gospel Topics essays. And over time, the way that my journey has led me is I've appeared on Mormon Stories podcast maybe a dozen times, more than that on Mormon Discussion podcast, including the Almost Awakened channel with Britt Hartley and with Bill Reel and Jana Spangler. I did a series with Bill and with Alan Mount and many other guests about the Gospel Topics essays. My Mormon Stories interview I did in August of 2019, and 2 years ago, it's 2.5 years ago, I did a TEDx talk called Thriving and Building Community After a Faith Crisis, and many people know me from that. I do have a podcast channel called Life After Deconstruction. And while I took about a year break uploading episodes, I've started uploading episodes again, and I enjoy coming on podcasts like yours. I can't remember what is this, number 3 or 4, maybe?
Yeah, somewhere in there.
4, yeah, something
like that. And I just really enjoy this space, and it's interesting to me, and I'm really grateful to be back to talk about biblical scholarship.
That's it.
I'm really excited about this one because, in my faith deconstruction, the Old Testament is really the book that took me out. I had other things that started disturbing me, but I spent 4 years looking at each of the standard works. And Yale has an online course. You can actually take online courses of religion from Yale, absolutely free. You just enroll. And they were incredible. And when I started looking into the Old Testament and learning about that, boy, that really, really led me out. I was going, because the Old Testament is the foundation. That none of the others can be true if the Old Testament has problems with it, because they're all built from that tradition. So I'm excited to talk about this.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I ran into is it was church history, and it was the recognition that my spiritual experiences had confirmed that was the attribution of meaning, confirmed the truthfulness of many partially and entirely inaccurate things. And as I was reading the Race and the Priesthood essay, what I concluded is that for the brethren also, for more than 125 years, at least on the topic of the ban, they didn't have actual capacity or mantles of discernment to be able to discern between their own biases and prejudices and actual inspiration from God, in spite of, surely they had spiritual experiences and testimonies that confirm the truthfulness of many of the teachings and doctrines that are now disavowed in that Race and the Priesthood essay. And that's what triggered my faith crisis. And I searched for resources because I'd never heard of the Gospel Topics essays. After I read them, I Google searched them and I found Mormon Think, and they do kind of reviews and a little bit of a takedown of several of them. And then I continued to search, and I found Mormon stories, and then I watched episodes with Tyler Glenn and Jeremy Reynolds. And then, of course, ended up reading the CS letter. And that just all the combination sent me down the rabbit hole. But it was actually reading the gospel topics essays that triggered my collapse, particularly the race and the priesthood essay. So then I wanted to try to make things work. And so I consumed large volumes of apologetics. Like Fair Mormon had this big list, index kind of thing that they continue to modify their website. But that just introduced a whole bunch of other host of problems that weren't, even addressed in these other places. And I was just trying to figure out how to reconcile everything. And my faith crisis was ongoing, and the grief and the whole thing. And then along the way, I have a friend who's actually an active believing member, and his brother used to teach BYU religion. He now teaches classics at BYU. And he told me that his brother suggests that he start reading Bart Ehrman. So this friend said, you should start reading Bart Ehrman, start with misquoting Jesus. And so I read that.
Wow, that's an odd choice for an active member or a BYU professor to tell you to read Bart Ehrman.
Well, you would think that, but the truth of the matter is that, if you talk with Trevin Hatch, who wrote A Stranger in Jerusalem, he's a BYU professor. His main thing is he's in the library, but he teaches there at BYU. And if you think of Dan McClellan, he'll recommend different things, and including he'll refer to Bart Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God, for example, and different courses that are available on Great Courses or whatever that website is called now. And so I unpacked, that's the word that I use. I unpacked or deconstructed New Testament text. And then, like you, Landon, the big realization that I came to, at least that was the realization for me, is that what's different about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is that it's fundamentally foundationally relies on Old Testament texts. And so then I started studying Old Testament biblical scholarship. I read David Bakaboy's book that talks about the documentary hypothesis and trying to do it in a faithful way. And then I went down the rabbit hole of how the Old Testament came to be, when it came to be, what different sources that there were, like Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Elliott Friedman. And there's a fantastic YouTube channel of secular Jewish scholars. I think it's JSH or something like that. But Israel Finkelstein and several other biblical scholars and archaeologists and so forth. And they're pretty much all people of Jewish heritage, talk about these things and how the Old Testament came to be. And what we'll talk about today is how that all this biblical scholarship of the New Testament and the Old Testament helped me. It solved my faith crisis because it gave context to how restoration scriptures came to be, that they were expressed by a man who held a fundamentalist, literalist view of biblical texts, particularly of Old Testament texts. Like Joseph Smith believed Adam and Eve and Enoch and Noah and Moses and Methuselah and Aaron and Melchizedek and all those people were literal historical individuals. Noah too, not characters in different ideological or origin myths. And as a result, Joseph expressed the book of Abraham and the book of Moses, and he expressed things in the Book of Mormon that are filtered or framed through his fundamentalist, literalist view. And I read other stuff like Pete Enns, and Rob Bell has a book. Rob Bell has a book called "What Is the Bible?" That was really enjoyable. and Pete Enns essentially expressed that scriptural texts represent, this is his view, scriptural texts represent people writing what they think God would have them write, as if God were actually literally speaking through them, as if they were sock puppets or a fax machine or something like that. But instead of it being top down, like God speaking through men like sock puppets, or via a fax machine, really what Pete Enns describes is that human beings experience a sense of divinity, and then they impute or create or attribute attributions of meaning to God, and they write what they believe God would want them to write if it was top down and instead of bottom up. And all of that ended up solving really my faith crisis, because it put everything in context. So I wrote this Facebook post regarding 4 things, and I've split them up for a conversation to go into them deeper, to kind of discuss and share and unpack why these things were so helpful for me with regard to biblical scholarship.
Well, the post had a lot of impact. Like I said, not only did I read the original, but then I kept seeing it popping up. Did anybody see Anthony's post? My friend Anthony posted this, and on all different platforms, from Faithful to Post-Mormon, to everything in between. So it definitely resonated. And so we're really excited for you to share this information, some of your conclusions and some of the thought process that you had. This will be good.
Thanks. So just so we don't create a straw man, like what a believer might argue that we're doing, what I thought I'd do is ask, as an active believing member of the church, to the extent that you were over the years, what was your understanding of scriptures, where they came from, the degree of historicity of them, were they like word for word parsed, like exactly, the mind and will of God, or, what was your understanding of scriptures in the church as an active believer?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, because I'm thinking probably Landon and I have different answers to that, as do any of our listeners or our viewers. So for me, I've talked about how I was raised before by what I call Orthodox, McConkie, Skousen, Benson Mormons. And so the scriptures were the word of God. The scriptures were more real to me than kind of things in my everyday life. I didn't have social media. I didn't have TV. I had nothing like that. We read scripture stories, and we read the Bible. We read all the books. We read church history stories. So to me, all that was very real. I remember thinking when I was super young, like 3 years old, my parents were talking about Parley P. Pratt as if it were a person in our ward. I thought that was a living person that was in my circle. And I felt the same way about the scriptures. I used to play Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by throwing my dolls into the dryer, turning the dryer on, and then my cat was Jesus. Yeah, I'd put my cat in. I mean, the scriptures, I was living them, and because that's how my parents were. That's how they were training me. And I never had any thought that they were anything other than what they were. And then, of course, as I got older, junior high, high school, other influences came into my life. I just never thought about them. I never thought they were not what my parents had told me. Even through college, I didn't really think about it until I got older and I had my own kids, and I was supposed to be teaching them, the scripture stories in the scriptures. And that's when I started looking at lesson manuals. I started looking at things and going, and then of course you just know more about the world. And I was a humanities major, more about history, more about literature, more about everything. And you start going, but it just doesn't quite compute that it would be literal. I admit it took me quite a while to arrive at that. But when you're immersed in it in your early years, it's just a fact. The scriptures are literal. They are the word of God. Matthew, Mark, John wrote them, that's how I viewed it. And I think Landon had a little bit of a different point of view, but that was mine.
So I'm interested in your view, Landon. What was your understanding?
Yeah, to me, it was the mind of God revealed to man through his living prophets. And that's what I grew up believing. And to me, there were parts that I would probably take not as literal, such as Jonah and the well. I don't know that I really ever bought into that story, but that could just be a teaching moment. But a majority of the people in there were certainly literal, because they had to be literal. It was never questioned whether they could even not be literal people, because they played such an important part in the entire gospel message. And it all falls apart if you don't have those things. For instance, Adam and Eve must be literal. If there is not a fall, there is no need for an atonement. So if the fall is not literal, then the atonement doesn't have to be literal. Jesus doesn't have to be literal. Everything becomes questionable at that point. So they had to be literal. There had to be a flood. There had to be Moses, because that's where the commandments came from. That's where the whole nation of Israel came from, that obeyed the laws, and that he was the God of these people. So it had to be literal to work. So I never questioned whether it was literal or not. I always assumed, because I'd always been taught, that it was literal, and that these prophets that were discussed were actual prophets of God who God was revealing his mind to. And that's the way I always pictured the scriptures.
Yeah, thanks, Landon. My experience kind of was a combination of both of you. My parents joined the church in 1969 when I was 3 years old in Mesa, Arizona. So I was raised as a McConkie Mormon. Like, we would read Mormon doctrine for his book for Family Home Evening, and just about every, as Sunday school classes got older, about every Sunday school class would like use that, if it was as if it were a supplementary lesson manual kind of thing. And my parents would send me to Cleon Skousen workshops, so I learned all about, without them saying John Birch Society, I learned about all that kind of stuff,
Yep.
very, very literal. And I took the scriptures, at face value, and the stories and the lessons that I received in seminary and institute and at church at face value. So like in the Articles of Faith, it expresses that we believe, the Bible, if there's error, basically what it expresses is that we believe the Bible is the word of God. And if there's errors, it's translation or copy errors in the Bible, right? Not original source text or writer errors, that it was, when it was communicated through the prophets, it was clear. And then in the Book of Mormon, it talks about plain and precious truths that were taken out, right, from the Bible, from evil and designing men and things like that. And so, like, my concept of scriptures was these were literal people, similar to Landon. Like, you needed a literal fall for there to be a need for a literal atonement. And in the stories that I was taught and what I read in the scriptures, Adam, is a literal historical person, because like he had an altar at Adam on Diamond, and in D&C 107, it explains that Adam through Noah lived in essentially North America, not too far from Adam on Diamond, and that they attributed the same meaning to Melchizedek priesthood as D&C 107 does. So the Melchizedek priesthood was a literal restoration of the attribution of meaning to priesthood that Adam and Noah and Methuselah and Enoch had, and they were literal. And like there was literally a city of Enoch, right, that gets lifted up into heaven, because that's what it expresses in the Book of Moses. And Abraham absolutely had to be a literal historical person, because the Book of Abraham talks about that. And there were literally 12 tribes of Israel and all of those kinds of things. And if anyone, as a believer, suggested that the character of Noah was like a composite mythical character from several different traditions, and that written Hebrew wasn't invented yet in 1300 to 1400 BCE when Moses is placed in time, and that there's no way he could have written any of the content that is in the 5 books attributed to Moses. Like, my answer would be, well, that can't be true, because Moses visited Joseph Smith, right? So he can't be a literary character or composite mythical character, because he visited Joseph Smith, right? And in the Book of Mormon, a guy gets his head cut off Laban gets his head cut off by by Nephi in order to get the brass plates that supposedly have the biblical canon that existed at 600 BCE written on brass plates, I think in Egyptian characters, but it had the 5 books of Moses, which we would understand to be the same as the 5 books of Moses in the Bible. And in the Book of Mormon, there's the verbiage of a vision of the latter days where we say a Bible, kind of thing. We have no need for more than the Bible kind of expression. Like, so this was the framework that I was coming from. And then as I, studied some of the things, I did an associate's in humanities, and my undergrad was in Spanish with a minor in English. I came to realize like there's some poetry kind of stuff going on there, but Noah had to be a real person. So maybe there was just a local flood, because like it doesn't really work for there to be a global flood. And like Adam had to be a real person, but maybe he didn't actually live 1,000 years in North America. But I still had to hold on to that literalism because to me it was foundational to the church. And it wasn't only foundational because it was in the Bible, it's because of the way those stories are expressed in restoration scripture and restoration theology and in the teachings of the prophets and apostles today. That's how I viewed scriptures, as authoritative. In fact, I viewed scriptures as the collective canon. If leaders of the church contradicted the canon, that the canon actually took some priority over what the modern day prophets and apostles would say, but that they had special mantles of discernment, so they could discern what was in the scriptures and teach us what God really wanted. So there was like a fix for it when that happened, kind of thing. But that's how I viewed scriptures. So similar to both of you.
And it's so opposite today, where it's the words of the living prophets that supersede past prophets, scriptures, anything. That's so interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like the more people have access to information on the internet, and the more they actually read scriptures, the more they realize that contemporary Latter-day Saint theology contradicts the canon a lot, right? Whether it's the word of wisdom, whether it's other kinds of things in the scriptures, it contradicts those things.
They always have that get around. Oh, that's because evil, wicked, conspiring men changed it. But when it originally came out, this is what it said.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, let's see. So
with that teaser, yes, let's see. It's already so fascinating.
Yeah. So let's see. All right. So let's look at this. So all right. So there were several. I'm going to go back a page. So the title of the discussion is How Biblical Scholarship Resolved My Faith Crisis, Help Make sense of Restoration Scriptures, help me make sense of church history, and help me make sense of my spiritual experiences. So, man, if I could have just known this like the day after I read the Gospel Topics essays, that would have been helpful.
You were in no condition to do that then. So.
No. Yeah.
Several years of processing.
Yeah. All right. So the first principle of biblical scholarship that was critical for me was that the number one is that the texts that we have in the scriptures generally express the theological, political, philosophical, and rhetorical goals and concerns in the specific time, context, place, and circumstances at the time they were written by the writer or redacted by the redactor, and that those themes, the theological, political, philosophical, and rhetorical goals, so forth, help us identify when the texts were actually written. So one way I would explain that is, if President Nelson gives a talk today, what he's expressing is his concerns about our day or in the very near future. He's very surely not giving a talk that's intended to be direct prophecy about what would happen 500 years from now, right? That just wouldn't make sense. He's talking about today. However, let's say President Nelson's words get written down, and 500 years from now, somebody reads President Nelson's words, and what he expresses really resonates for the experience of the people in that time, 500 years from now. And what they do is they liken the scriptures unto themselves, and they come up with a view that really President Nelson's words were intended to be direct prophecy about their day. That could happen, right? And so what they might do in that day, just keep on following me on this. What they might do in that day is they might write texts and tell stories that evidence that President Nelson's words not only were intended to be direct prophecy, but they were fulfilled in that day. And then let's say 500 years after that, somebody reads President Nelson's words, and then they read the words of the people 500 years later. So it's 1,000 years now after President Nelson spoke. And they read those words and they see, of course, why can't everyone see it? President Nelson's words were intended to be direct prophecy about what would happen 500 years later. And then someone 500 years later wrote about it, how the prophecy was fulfilled. So we know that it was all intended to be direct prophecy about what would happen 500 years later. Here's the evidence. And so we can know that not only the original thing was direct prophecy, but the prophecy was fulfilled. And we can rely on the theology that was written 500 years after President Nelson spoke. Now, that idea happens in scriptures. So, for example, what biblical scholars would tell you is that Isaiah, the words actually written by Isaiah, are expressing the theological, political, and philosophical and rhetorical goals and concerns in Isaiah's day. And then there's Deutero-Isaiah and Trito-Isaiah. And one of the ways that they know that Deutero-Isaiah was written a long time after the actual Isaiah wrote, that was written during and after the Babylonian exile, is because the writer of those texts, first of all, doesn't even use Isaiah's name and expresses concerns and what is happening during the exile and during the potential return to Jerusalem of the Jews. And Trito-Isaiah also expresses those things. But what happened is there's imagery in those words of Isaiah that, like the imagery of the wounded servant, like if you read Isaiah, the wounded servant is Israel, right? Or if you read Isaiah 7, where it talks about a young maiden has born a child, those things aren't referring to Jesus. Those things are referring to imagery and what was happening when those texts were written, when Isaiah was written. And then centuries later, those themes very well may have connected with what the historical Jesus was experiencing. He probably, most likely, seems like he would have thought that the kingdom of God was at hand, that he was going to be a part of it. And he may have adopted some of those themes, believing that they were intended to be direct prophecy about him. Certainly, whether or not the historical Jesus did, the writers of, the book, whoever wrote the gospel attributed to Matthew believed it, because he used words and texts from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of what we call the Old Testament today, including a mistranslation that a son would be born of a virgin rather than a son has been born of a young maiden, and imputes that as meaning that it was intended to be direct prophecy about the historical Jesus. And so later, when Christians or Mormons would read the Bible, they would say, why can't Jews understand this? Like in the Old Testament, there are all these prophecies that are about Jesus. And then there's these New Testament texts that clearly show that they were intended to be direct prophecy about Jesus, whether it's Ezekiel or Isaiah or other texts, or themes from the book of Daniel. And so how come they can't see it? It's because the Jews know that it wasn't intended to be direct prophecy. They probably, or if it was intended to be direct prophecy, the Christians got it wrong, kind of thing. So in any event, this is also one way how we can know when restoration texts were written. A lot of biblical scholars and Latter-day Saint and post Latter-day Saint scholars will point out that the themes and the theology and the political and philosophical concerns expressed in the Book of Mormon are the concerns in Joseph's day, right? Infant baptism, universalism, what's happening with secret combinations in societies like the Freemasons, folklore magic, things about evil and conspiring men and God cursing their treasures that they put in the earth and they sink into the ground, which comes from folklore magic, right? Where Joseph would do treasure digging and if you didn't do everything right, and kill the dog right and do everything, then the treasure would sink further into the ground. So that's how one way that we can know when the Book of Mormon text was expressed, because it is dealing with the theological, political, philosophical, and rhetorical goals and concerns in Joseph's day. They don't really match the concerns, of a Jewish people in 600 BCE. Like they wouldn't have gotten all upset about infant baptism in the Americas, because there weren't Catholics doing infant Christian baptism in the Americas. They wouldn't have been all upset about that in 400 CE when Moroni and Mormon are placed in time. So this is one of the first things, and I just wanted to ask what you think about that.
Yeah, Landon will tell you, hit on my hot button right there, the infant baptism. I have always said that does not belong there. The fact that it's there is a dead giveaway once you really think about it. And that's what happened to me. Once I really understood what they were saying, I was like, no, I get it now. So, and then our episodes with Dr. John Lundwall really hit home. The people in the Americas at that time, that there could be nothing farther from their mind as to whether or not, an argument over infant baptism had absolutely no bearing on their lives or anything. So yeah, it's my hot button, isn't it, Landon? Infant baptism.
Well, we just learned from Elder Bednar that happened because people were not
Yes.
standing up and singing at the right time, or they were sitting when they were supposed to be standing, and that led to the infant baptism problem. But certainly that's a something where he converted that to his day. But I absolutely 100% agree with what you're saying. No prophet is out there telling you what's going to happen 500 years or 1,000 years from now, because nobody cares. I mean, think about it. When we're sitting there in science class and they tell us the sun's going to burn out in 1.3 billion years, and we go, oh my gosh, we better get started on that problem right now. We don't care. It's well past our lifetime.
Yeah.
Why are we going to listen to that? Why would anyone listen to a prophet who's talking about something that's going to happen way outside their lifetime? They're just not going to care. We talked about this with Dan McClellan just a week ago when we did our episode on the Book of Revelation. The Book of Revelation was not prophesying about impending doom and a second coming 2,000 years later. He was talking about an impending doom and a second coming right then.
Yeah.
In the next few years. That's what the author believed, and that's what he was writing about. And that's the same thing we see in these texts. They're writing about their day, their time, their politics, and often they're using those books to manipulate the people to come around to their politics. It wasn't uncommon for kings to use the prophet to strengthen his and boost his kingship by having the prophet prophesy things about him, or make it sound like he was the chosen one to lead the people, because that solidified his kingship. So we see that all over in the Old Testament. And once you know how to read the Old Testament, you start seeing all of the political intrigue. It's a fascinating read once you understand how to read it, because you can see the politics going on behind the scenes in the book.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding as I studied the development of the Pentateuch, the 5 books attributed to Moses, that there were multiple source material. There was material from some of the Israelite tribes in the north, and from the Jewish tribe, the tribe of Judah in the south, and there were what they call J source, which has to do with the deity Yahweh or Jehovah. And if you follow Dan McClellan or do some of the study, you'll realize that the deity Jehovah didn't exist as a deity when the brother of Jared is placed in time, and monotheism didn't exist in 600 BCE when the brass plates are placed in time, and that Yahweh or Jehovah in many ways was a borrowing of a Canaanite deity named Baal, and then morphed into like a replacement or a separate storm deity, and then was eventually elevated to be the main deity. And then there was another deity named El that was like kind of the head of the pantheon of gods. And these, like almost Greek mythology, where like gods would fight against each other and have different priorities and things like that. El was a god. And in learning that kind of biblical scholarship, the first place that you really see that is if you read Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2 through the balance of the second creation story. In Genesis 1, there's a story of a deity that speaks things into being. Not a very personal God, speaks things into being, creates Adam and Eve together and gives them one particular commandment. And then that's it. And then Genesis 2, you read of a different kind of deity. So Genesis 1 is from the deity, the J source, Yahweh, which is like speaks things into being, not really that anthropomorphic, at least when that version was written. And then the Genesis chapter 2, the deity like walks in the garden, like with the deity's hands creates Adam. And then Adam's lonely. So then the deity's like, oh, I'll fix it. I'll create animals. And then Adam won't be lonely. Whew, that didn't work. So like that deity tries something, it doesn't work. So then that deity then takes a rib from Adam and creates Eve, so that then Adam wouldn't be lonely. And then he comes up with a different commandment, right? And so people who hold a fundamentalist literalist view are trying to reconcile these competing commandments to what were the competing commandments? To have children but not eat of the tree of the of knowledge of good and evil. But they're not really competing commandments. They're commandments from two different creation myths. And so there were two different creation myths based on two different deities. And so there are biblical scholars will tell you there are source texts that have fragments from each of these different types of origin myths related to these two different deities. And then there are what they call priestly source and pre-priestly source. So the priestly source is likely written much later, around, during, and after the Babylonian exile. And that's where they're concerned about the law of Moses and all of those kinds of things, and a centralization of a temple in Jerusalem and stuff like that. And then the priestly source is concerned about other things. And when people, embarrassed that when I read the Bible, like I didn't recognize that like there's different sets of 10 commandments because there were different deities upon which they were based. And there's different flood myth stories. Like the one that gets taught is that there were two of all kinds of animals, but then there's another one that's the priestly source version where there had to be different numbers of clean and unclean animals because there had to be animals that had to be used for sacrifices and so forth. So, and then what biblical scholars would tell you is that a lot of the other things in the Pentateuch, the 5 books attributed to Moses, are mergers of traditions from the Judahite tribe and some of the Israelite tribes to try to form a narrative that they had common ancestors, that Abraham actually was this literal historical person that had Isaac as a son, and then Jacob as a son who fights with God and wins. Like, imagine that, you fight with God and win. And then, so Jacob gets called Israel. And then Jacob has these, I think he has 5 wives and then 12 sons, right? And so from then there's these 12 tribes of Israel, and they end up being enslaved. First of all, God promises them the land of what we would call Israel today, which is a political claim, right? Or a land claim. And then in the origin story, like they're enslaved, and then there's an exodus and there's not evidence of a mass exodus as it's represented, but then there's the story of the conquest where they go in and they kill the Canaanites, but that didn't happen. And so then all of these stories that are put together in the 5 books attributed to Moses have a combination of these different conflicting origin myths, and then it's formulated to provide a framework of dominance of authority in Jerusalem of the priestly class and a divine claim to the land as they return after the exile. That's what the 5 books attributed to Moses are about. And like, I missed all of that, and Joseph Smith did too.
You're not alone. It was 1800 before people started noticing this, really. But you're so right, because once you see it, you can't not see it anymore when you start reading the scriptures. I know, to me, it was the source, the first chapter of Genesis. It's the name of the deity. They always call him El. El is God's name. In the beginning, God.
Right.
Instead of God, it would be El. But then in chapter 2, every time they refer to God, they call him the Lord in King James Version, but that would have been Jehovah. So they're always calling him El all the way through when the one story goes, and then they're always calling him a different name in the next story. And then when you take that flood story, and you can take the 2 flood stories, the 2 by 2 and the 7, and you line them up in one set of the stories, they're always calling him El. In the Adam and Eve story, they're always calling him El. But then in the other Adam and Eve story, they're always calling him Jehovah. And in the other Noah story, they're always calling him Jehovah. And that's why we have 2 different names for the mountains in Moses's time, because one person called it one name and one called it the other. And to me, I wrote down, this was my favorite book, and you mentioned it, Who Wrote the Bible, by Richard Friedman. And he makes it so clear, and he goes through and he talks about the 2 classes of priests. There were the Mushites, who were believed to be Moses's descendants, and they were in control in the northern kingdom. And you had the Aaronites, who were Aaron's descendants, and they were in control in the southern kingdom. And there was 2 different priestly groups up until Solomon. And then the Mushites backed Solomon's brother, one of his stepbrothers, whatever it was. And from that point on, they were out. When Solomon became the king, he kicked the Mushites out. But you have the stories told by the Mushites and the stories told by the Aaronites. And the Mushite stories, every time you see Aaron doing something bad in the scriptures, it comes from the Mushite source. They're trying to tell you why the Aaronites shouldn't be in charge. And whenever you see Moses doing something bad, it's coming from the priestly or the Aaronite band. So you see, it's like having the Democrats and the Republicans both write a book about the history of the United States, and then you put them together and it makes sense because you're seeing it from both angles. But
Yeah.
if you read them separately, they're two completely different views on how it came about. And so when you start reading it and you see that and you see the fighting and you see why did Aaron build the golden calf? Well, that's the Mushites telling you that Aaron built the golden calves, So once you start understanding that, you go, oh my goodness. And then when you start saying, why did all the 12 brothers, why was Judah so bad? And why was, we read about those guys and we say, they are horrible people. Why did God choose them? Well, every time someone did something horrible, it was the other side trying to say, oh, Judah doesn't have claim to the throne. And the Aaronites are saying, well, Judah's what, number 4 son? So they have to say some reason that the first 3 sons were no longer worthy to have the birthright, and that's why Judah has it, and that's why they're in charge. So when you start seeing the political interaction, it just becomes so fascinating, and you just sit and go, wow, this is a cool story, even though it's not true.
It's Fox News versus CNN.
Yes.
And it is, I have such a greater appreciation for the Old Testament, New Testament, knowing all that. It's a cultural, political, artistic, socioeconomic, social. It's this history of what you see there. So I have, God doesn't figure into it. I mean, except for the manipulation by man, but
because man is claiming that God, preferenced them, whoever the writer or redactor is.
Yep.
And another thing that biblical scholars would express is these characters who are these sons of Israel, Jacob, they're literary characters. So it'd be like if we wrote a history of America and we had an ancestor named America. And there was an ancestor of the UK named Britain, kind of thing. That's funny. So biblical scholars would explain that, first of all, there were more than 12 tribes. There were many more than that. And they would explain that these stories of creating this ideological origin myth of having a common ancestor and a claim to the land are inventing historical ancestors as characters who are the originators of the tribes in order to form this story to say that they're all related. But it's a literary convention. It's not actual history. Which is a problem for your patriarchal blessing.
Yes.
Wouldn't that be interesting if they gave it to you and it was one of those additional tribes, not the 12, and you are from the house of, I don't know, Mukahahi. You're
right.
Like, what? Who's that?
Yeah. Yeah. Revelation would have to be top down instead of bottom up for that.
That would not work.
All right. So let's go back. All right. So what we've talked about here is that the things that we were talking about correlate to this number one thing, that the writers and redactors of the text were expressing their concerns about their day. So the number two thing is that if we want to better understand scriptural texts, it's helpful to better understand the context and concerns that existed in the time and location the text was written or added to or redacted. And one really great example of that is, I need to look at my notes here, is 2 Nephi 25:23, which has the phrase, "For we know it is by grace that we are saved after all we can do." So Dan McClone actually did a pretty extensive study of this. Because for a long time in the church, what that meant was we're saved by grace after we have exhausted all our efforts. And what Dan McClellan learned is after all we can do meant in spite of all we can do. So that's a significant difference in theology, right? We're saved by grace after we have first exhausted all our efforts versus we're saved by grace in spite of all we can do. So the way you understand what was being expressed in that text in 2 Nephi 25:23 is to understand how the words were used and the theology was understood in Joseph Smith's day, not in Nephi's day. That doesn't make any sense, right? It's in Joseph Smith's day.
Mhm.
And so that's why Dan McClellan has said multiple times in different venues on his TikTok channel, and including on his Mormon Stories interview, that if you want to better understand the Book of Mormon, you need to study it as a 19th century text, because it's dealing with the concerns and the language and phrasing of that day. So anyway, what are your thoughts about that?
It's kind of a loaded statement. In order to understand the Book of Mormon, you have to entertain the idea that it does resonate with concerns and cares of the 19th century. So, no, but again, that goes back to my infant baptism. As soon as you recognize the things that would never have been anything for the people of Nephi or anyone in the ancient scriptures, then you start to see it for what it is, and you start to see the 19th century fingerprint everywhere.
Right.
And that's how we can see in the Old Testament. You look at the 5 books of Moses, and we've got huge problems with that because, we all learned in Sunday school that, they escaped from Egypt and they were out in the wilderness. And how did they eat? God sent manna from heaven, right? They had to go collect the manna from heaven. They didn't have animals. They didn't have all of these food to eat. Yet we read in there that they were to bring their animals into the priest to be sacrificed, and the priest would take his hook and he'd get, well, where are these animals coming from if you're wandering in the desert for 40
and how are you feeding them?
and how are you feeding them?
Oh.
So you start saying, were these laws really given to a people while they were wandering in the wilderness? Because this doesn't sound like a concern of people in the wilderness, but it does sound like a priestly concern to a priestly group who wants to show you that it's always been an important practice that you bring your animals and sacrifice them. And we see the same things if a neighbor leaves on vacation and the animal dies, who's responsible? These are all laws in, I think, Leviticus. Well, who's going on vacation and leaving their animals to their neighbors when they're wandering in the wilderness?
Yep.
These things are out of place, they're out of time, and that's how we start looking at it, and that's how we can identify that this scripture is out of place and out of time. Therefore, it can't possibly have been written at the time that they're discussing.
But it makes it really interesting because then you're understanding the concerns of the redactors and writers around the time of the Babylonian exile and thereafter. That's what they're really concerned about. And so they're inserting that into the story as they're creating this collective combining of legends, origin myth, that give them a claim to the land and a political class and structure that is based on, the priests and the law of Moses.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, once you understand it, it's so much fun to read and say, what are they trying to say here? Or what's going on here?
What's really happening?
What really happened? Yep.
Yeah. All right. So let's go back here to number 3. All right. So this is long, sorry, but we'll get through it. And the third principle with related to biblical scholarship is where there are really specific direct prophecies in scriptural texts, and where those specific prophecies actually later come true in the story. They are generally easy to identify as backdated prophecies that are composed pseudepigraphically, which means in the name of a different person than is the actual writer or narrator of the text. And the backdated prophecies are composed after the events had already happened. And then in the storyline, as we get closer in time chronologically to when the texts were actually composed, we tend to see prophecies shift to be more generalized as we're getting closer to when the writer writes them, and less specific, like in the Book of Mormon, that there would be evil and conspiring men. That's like a general prophecy that exists in all times, right?
When aren't there?
Or of wars and rumors of wars, or of a loss of faith and obedience. These are generalized things that happen on all times. And then a reliable way, biblical scholars would tell you, to identify when a text was actually expressed or composed is in the chronology of the story, is where the specific prophecies begin to be wrong. Now, I'm gonna back up. So this is how biblical scholars know, or at least what they express that they know, when the book of Daniel was written. So the book of Daniel is historically the latest written text that ended up getting added to what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible canon. It was written around 167 BCE, plus or minus. But it's represented as being a very old text written by Daniel with intentional apocalyptic prophecies about what would happen in the future. And it's such an influential text that themes from the book of Daniel permeate through New Testament texts. And it probably informed, what Jesus and his followers believed were going to happen because of these apocalyptic themes in Daniel. And there's imagery in Daniel that get used to claim that it's supposed to be specific, intentional, direct prophecy about Jesus. But really what the book of Daniel is it's a text that was written centuries and centuries after the fact, where there were prophecies about things that actually already had happened, like different kingdoms and the stone cut out of the mountain, that would roll and fill the whole earth. And all of those kinds of things are prophecies that are backdated about things that already happened. They aren't about our day. They aren't about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They weren't about Jesus. They were prophecies. They were backdated prophecies. And then as it gets closer to the period, some of them were wrong. The oldest ones were wrong because the writer, missed some of the details. And then they get more specific, and then they start to get more general or close to the time that it was actually written. And then the prophecies are wrong. And that's how they know it was written around 167 BCE, is because that's when all of a sudden the prophecies are wrong. So in the Book of Mormon, we have a similar thing. We have Joseph Smith narrating a prophecy of Nephi, that Joseph Smith would be the person that would narrate the Book of Mormon, and that his father's name would be Joseph, and that Joseph of Egypt knew about this, right? That degree of specificity. Or that Jesus's name would be Jesus Christ, which isn't a name. Christ is the anointed one. So it's Jesus, the anointed. Christ isn't his name, but Joseph didn't know that. So Jesus Christ would be his name, and that Mary would be his mother's, like really specific prophecies about the pilgrims or righteous Gentiles coming to the United States, about
Revolutionary War,
Christopher Columbus.
Yes.
Christopher Columbus.
Yeah. Without Columbus by name. Yeah.
Right.
About the Bible, we've, we've got a Bible. We don't need more Bible, like really specific prophecies. And then what happens when you read the Book of Mormon, there are really specific prophecies. And then as you get closer to the 1800s, then they become more generalized. Like there'd be evil and designing men and a lack of faith and obedience and things like that. And then there are prophecies in the Book of Mormon that are wrong. And that's how you know when it was written. Like the Book of Mormon indicates that the righteous Gentiles would unite with the literal lineal descendants of the Lamanites, and together they would eviscerate and violently overthrow the wicked Gentiles. Like, so that hasn't happened unless people think all the Mormons are going to unite with people that live on Indian reservations and start a civil war and kill all the rest of the Gentiles. Like, that's not going to happen. So that's how we know it's a false prophecy, right? And that's how we know when the text was written. Or the Book of Mormon talks about the literal lineal descendants of the Lamanites blossoming like a rose. Like, and when I was on my mission in the 1980s, and there were all sorts of baseball baptisms and things happening in Central and South America, I thought that was a fulfillment of prophecy, but they were baseball baptisms. They weren't real. And indigenous Americans have been decimated. It is terrible. And the Book of Mormon in part justifies that as like a result, like God punishes people based not on their own sins, but the sins of their ancestors. Like there's an article of faith that contradicts that. But that's how you know when the book of, another way that you know when the Book of Mormon was written is because when there are direct prophecies that are fulfilled, it's a backdated prophecies.
I heard recently, speaking of making a prophecy come true, the statement that there are moon Quakers, right? 6 feet tall men that live on the moon. Again, that hadn't happened yet. And so that's incorrect. Somebody said, well, that was just kind of worded wrong. There was a 6 foot tall man who was in office, President Nixon, when we went to the moon, and he was Quaker in origin. So yeah, I know. Back to church, everybody.
Twisty. Yeah. Gymnastics.
Twisty. I like that.
Yeah.
All right. It's like a puzzle, which I love. I totally agree with both of you that when you understand this and you start looking for it, it's way more fascinating than the actual text when you dissect it that way.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So the next one, number 4, is whoops, I skipped forward to 5. Number 4 is the existence and idea of a biblical canon as a very late development that didn't happen until many, many centuries after original texts were later canonized into a Bible, many centuries after they were written or redacted. Biblical scholars suggest that the overwhelming evidence is that not one of the writers of the texts that were later canonized into a Bible or into a canon wrote or expressed their texts with a knowledge or expectation that their texts were going to be aggregated into a single biblical canon. So, so that's a problem for restoration scripture, because Joseph Smith presents this idea in restoration texts that all these people that were at the head of each dispensation and the writers of they knew they were writing texts that would be part of a canon, that the writers of New Testament texts knew that they were writing something that was going to be part of a book. There wasn't even a concept of a book. There were like scrolls, but there was no concept of a biblical canon. And one of the most anachronistic things of the Book of Mormon, and that that it couldn't, be historical in the way that is expressed, is there was no such thing as a biblical canon in 600 BCE. Certainly it didn't have the 5 books of Moses, and it didn't have Deutero Isaiah. It wouldn't have had Malachi. Certainly didn't have, when the long ending of Mark hadn't been invented yet. The idea of the Sermon on the Mount being one sermon that was given instead of a compilation of sayings from different things. All of that is super anachronistic. And the idea that the writers knew that they were compiling things that were, it was their role to write things that would be part of a biblical canon is extremely anachronistic. It didn't exist. So it's a problem for the brass plates. It's a problem for the book of Ether, and this idea that the brother of Jared writes, the great vision from the beginning of the worlds to the end, and that other prophets had seen all of that, and that it was, going to be expressed in a book, and John the Revelator was responsible to write some of it. And like that, biblical scholars would say that that's absurd because it wasn't even a concept in the past.
It's a problem for the Book of Moses as well, because even though the Book of Moses was supposedly a revelation given, we have the same P and E and J breaks that we have in the Old Testament. So, he was given a revelation that he saw Moses writing all these things, and yet we know that there were at least 3 different writers writing that section. Yeah. So how did he have a revelation of Moses writing it if it was a compilation of 3 different people and he didn't know that? But he's using the 3 different, it's all L in the first, and then it goes to the Jehovah text, just like it does in Genesis. So he's clearly copying from a text. He's not seeing this in a vision.
Yeah. And these kinds of things, as I go through each of these things, to me, they provide context for restoration scripture, where Joseph Smith held a fundamentalist literalist view of these things. He believed what these things contradict. He believed that it was understood that there would be a biblical canon. He believed that attributions of meaning in later days were understood in older days. He believed that all of those things. And so he expressed scriptural texts through through a cognitive framework that the Bible was literally true, literally historical, about literal historical people, that Noah was a real person and Noah visited him in person, and Adam was a real person, and Enoch was a real person, and Melchizedek was a real person, not the king of Sodom, but of Salem, right? Well, I'm going to get into more with the next one, but Joseph created these texts through a fundamentalist literalist view, and that answers the question. It answered the question for me because a common apologetic that I continue to see today is almost like the watchmaker argument for how people attribute meaning to God, in that they claim if there's complexity in the text, that means it has to be true, right? If there's complexity in the text and Joseph wasn't capable of creating it, then that means it's true. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean it was true that there was such a thing as a canon in 600 BCE, with brass plates. It doesn't make it true that there was such a thing as monotheism, or that Yahweh, Jehovah, existed as a deity when the brother of Jared is placed in time, and that he was the premortal Jesus. Like, none of that existed. One thing that didn't exist that Dan McClellan talks about and other biblical scholars is the concept of an individual Satan character who was the devil, and the brother of Jesus is the Mormon thing, that because they were both sons of God. Like, that didn't exist until Jesus's time. Then there was a Satan character, or a devil who tempted him, in the wilderness when he was fasting. But that is a very, very late development. The idea of a single Satan character, rather than just there's an adversary or an executioner of God or whatever, that didn't exist in 600 BCE. So when Joseph Smith imputes those ideas into the book of Abraham, into the book of Moses, and into the book of Mormon, that those are modern creations, because that concept, that theology didn't exist when those characters are placed in time. It's fatally, there are many things that are fatally anachronistic to the idea of historicity, but that's one of them. Yeah. So if a apologist says, yeah, but there's all this complexity and there's chiasms, and there's all these different symbolisms, like a Jewish law proceeding or something like that, and they're pulling out all these things saying all this complexity exists, therefore because it's complex it must be true. Complexity is a different question than whether it's true, because biblical scholars will say just the fact that there's an individual Satan character, that's fatally anachronistic to the idea that the books of Mormon, Moses, or Abraham could have any basis in something that's true, because it didn't exist. It wasn't invented yet.
Not yet. I think it's interesting how LDS study the other books aside from the Book of Mormon. And I've heard this expressed, you have Come Follow Me, you have a book a year. In the years where you're not studying the Book of Mormon, I've heard people say, oh, I feel so guilty that I'm not reading the Book of Mormon, right? I know we're supposed to read these other books. And even those books are filtered through the idea of the Book of Mormon and the restoration. You're not just sitting there reading the Book of Mormon, or reading the Bible or the New Testament, the Old Testament. You're not doing that. You're filtering it through everything. So you never get this pure picture like what we're talking about now, or what you discover on your own, where you really sit down and I'm going to study. That come follow me, it just, it picks and chooses the scriptures and the stories. Even in seminary, they no longer, like I'm sure all three of us of a certain age, you had to read every word of every book, right?
Right.
Pass it off. You had to sit there and read the Old Testament. They don't do that anymore. You have certain scriptures that you master. You have scriptures you work on your own under the, auspice of your seminary teacher. You're not reading it. You're not going to make those connections because you're not reading it. And you have this dog whistle to you that says what you really need to be reading is the Book of Mormon, to the point where people actually say, oh, thank goodness we're back on the Book of Mormon. That other stuff. Yeah, the Book of Mormon. So I don't think most people are going to get it because they just aren't allowed the exposure.
I remember studying Abraham in Old Testament class, and the lesson on Abraham was about celestial marriage.
Exactly.
And
that's
I'm
what
going,
I'm talking about. Filtered.
Didn't Abraham send his wife that was
Hagar?
out into the wilderness to die?
Is that
celestial marriage? And didn't he send his son? And
nope.
And they were tricked into marrying someone other than his wife.
Nope, they'll pick a gospel principle.
Celestial marriage.
Yep. Nope.
Well, it is. I mean, if you read DNC 132, it is the law of wives and concubines.
Yeah.
So you got the sex slaves in there too.
Oh.
But yeah, so there's one thing that I would allude to at this point that really fits with what you're both saying, and that is how our brains work with regard to confirmation bias.
Mm-hmm.
When we're in a confirmation bias situation, our brain has the propensity to only see things that support our biases. And then when we have a shift, then we can't unsee the shift. So what I sometimes use as an example, because most people have experienced this, is like if they've never ridden in a Subaru, they know there are Subarus on the road, and they recognize cars, but they probably don't recognize the number of Subarus, how common they are, and all of them that are out there. But once they buy and start driving a Subaru, the way their mind works is they see them everywhere. They recognize all the Subarus. Like in the past, they would have, depending on where they live, they might have passed 30 Subarus on their drive to work in the morning and recognized one or two. And then once they start driving a Subaru, they see all of them, right? And how this works with regard to the kinds of things that we're talking about is when you have a carefully parsed narrative that harvests particular theologies with the idea that the Book of Mormon texts are supporting those theologies, that's what you see. But if you've studied how the Bible came to be and how the New Testament came to be, and some of these principles that we're talking about, and you go back and you read the Book of Mormon now, you can't unsee these things. You can't unsee a 19th century theology in the Book of Mormon. You can't unsee versions of, a version of theology that excludes contemporary Mormon theology, that what you think Mormonism is, right? Like 3 degrees of glory, or 2 different priesthoods, or that you had to have priesthood in order to be baptized or something like that, right? And then when you learn that the Book of Mormon was narrated, what we call the 116 pages, and then it was picked up at Mosiah, and then it continues through chronologically until Mormon was narrated, and then Joseph goes back and narrates the small plates of Nephi, and then he finishes up with the Book of Moroni. What all of a sudden you recognize that like in Mosiah, King Benjamin gives us all sermon and no one gets baptized. What
happened to that?
Nobody gets baptized. And then not too much later, Alma, when he leaves, King Noah, and he goes baptized, is like, but what was their priesthood? Like, was it a covenant or was it a witness to God? Like, it probably wasn't an ordinance. It was like an expression of faith, right? And then you go further along, and the actual theology of what baptism evolves during the course of the narration of the Book of Mormon, so that by the time Second Nephi is narrated. It's an ordinance, and it has to be done. And Jesus had to be baptized to fulfill all righteousness. But King Benjamin didn't know that. Mm-mm. And Alma, the oldest Alma, didn't know that because the theology hadn't developed.
How many common members do you think understand the actual chronology of how the Book of Mormon was written? Because when I finally looked into that and looked at some different graphics, I was like, oh my God, I mean, you can so clearly see it. Do you think the average member understands what was written much later? Because that is so telling.
I would be surprised if there's more than 1 in 20 active
Really?
believing members who realize that that the order of narration was with Mosiah priority, because they had to have had, like, I don't know, a parent or an uncle or a seminary teacher or a religion professor, who taught them that,
right?
Because they're not going to get it from manuals.
No, they're not. I'm surprised they don't talk about that. They talk about every other bit of minutia, but the chronology and the evolution of the theology is so apparent when you put everything in actual order. But of course, they don't want you to see it that way.
Yeah,
to me, it's fascinating. If y'all haven't looked into that, seriously, go Google it. There's some awesome charts out there, but it really shows the evolving theology. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, the confirmation bias is like not driving a Subaru. When you listen to the lessons, you teach from the lesson manuals, and you read the Book of Mormon with the small plates of Nephi first, you totally miss what we're talking about. And then once we bring it up, you can't unsee it. It's like you see Subarus everywhere.
Yeah, the same thing holds true with the New Testament. I don't think, especially as many people have read the New Testament, you think they would know that. But the whole idea of Q and Quell, where if you look at the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I always knew there were synoptic gospels, which means the same, meaning they're kind of telling the same story. But you get a book, there's a book out there called, I think it's Gospel Parallels, where it lays the similar stories are laid out side by side, and you start reading them. They're not just similar, they're word for word. Yeah. But they're only word for word wherever Jesus is speaking.
Yeah.
So when Jesus says something, it's word for word. They might change it. Instead of he, it says the Lord or something. But the number of words that are identical in the sentence in the same order tells you they're all copying from the same source. But the problem is they're all telling a different story using the same quote. So the quote's being used, but it's being used in a different story in each of the things, which leads you to believe they only have the quotes, they only have the sayings, and they've built the stories up around the sayings to emphasize the story. And once you compare those side by side, and that's what Q is source, and Bible scholars believe that there was a source text, which was a sayings document that they're all copying from. And that's why they're using word for word the same words of Jesus, but they're not telling the same story because the story didn't exist in Q. They're taking stories they'd heard about Jesus and they're building them up around his words and making a story up out of it. And once you start seeing that, you start going, this is problematic. If the witnesses of Christ are telling me stories that are kind of made up, or at least parts taken and put together to make a story that may or may not be true.
Yeah, they're laying a theology, their own political, philosophical, and rhetorical goals on top of a historical character of Jesus. I really enjoyed, and it was really helpful to read Bart Ehrman, but he's not the only biblical scholar. James Tabor has a course actually that you can take about the Book of Mark. The Book of Mark was the earliest written text. It's the shortest gospel, and it has the lowest Christology of the four gospels. And what biblical scholars will tell you is the way the long ending of Mark ends is Jesus dies, he's put in the tomb, and the women go to the tomb, and the tomb is empty, and I think it's one angel. Is it one angel in that one? Speak to them. and says, go tell everybody, and the women run away afraid, and that's the end of the story.
Yeah.
Like there's this series on Netflix called Messiah. I don't know if you've seen it. Like, it's an amazing series, and there's only one season of it, and it ends in a really cool way, and then it's over. and so somebody's got to write the long ending of Messiah, right? Because or a second season, they got to write Matthew or Luke, so because they didn't like the end of the story.
Yeah.
And what Bart Ehrman will express, and other biblical scholars, is if you take the like the Last Supper through the crucifixion and resurrection narratives in each of the Gospels, and you read them chronologically side by side, you can see that they're irreconcilably contradictory. And it's because each of the writers were trying to express something different, and the later writers were trying to correct the early writers. Like the writers of Matthew and Luke, they didn't like Mark's ending.
They didn't like his beginning either, because in Mark, Jesus isn't the Christ until his baptism, and that's when Jesus comes and says, "This is my son." There's no virgin birth. Then you get Matthew and Luke, which have a virgin birth, so Jesus is the Son of God from his birth. But then you go to John, and Jesus was in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So Jesus is God before he's even born. So the further out you go, the
sooner he's divine.
The sooner he's divine, and the more great the resurrection is at the end of the story. So
and Paul, Mark, and John, the latest writer of those, John, they didn't even care about the nativity narrative because it probably wasn't invented yet, or whoever wrote John thought, we don't need it if he's divine from before the earth. We don't need the nativity narrative. So, all right, next one. All right. There's a common misunderstanding that texts in the Bible are univocal, with God clearly and explicitly directing the words through men, almost as if they are almost as if the men were like sock puppets, or as if God expressed direct and specific words through them as if they were a fax machine. However, the evidence is beyond overwhelming that the texts are not univocal. Rather, they are expressions from men who frame their own beliefs, biases, philosophies, theologies, and preferences through their own fallible mortal understandings, often in contradictory ways. I mean, we've been talking about this just now with the Gospels, and it's a significant misunderstanding to claim that the writers knew they were writing chapters for a single book or codex. So that made scriptures way more interesting. Like, the Gospels are way more interesting, realizing that they're drawing on common legends. They're imputing meaning on the historical Jesus. They're sometimes correcting each other, sometimes borrowing from each other, because they're trying to present a particular narrative. That makes it way more interesting. And when you read the epistles attributed to Paul, like the ones actually written by Paul are contradicted by ones falsely, forgeries that were falsely attributed to Paul. So like Paul talks about women that are in the service, including a female apostle Junia, and then a later falsely forgery attributed text to Paul suggests that women should be silent in church and not even pray in church. Like, it's totally contradictory.
Let alone be an apostle.
Right. Yeah. So clearly it's not univocal. Unless God, they're not univocal.
Well, Bart Ehrman, what's the book, Early Christianities? But he writes about that there wasn't one Christianity at the time of Jesus. There were multiple Christianities, and that each one of them was writing scripture based on their belief system and trying to convince you that their belief system is right. And you see in Revelation where John is saying, if anyone's teaching you anything else, don't believe it. Well, who are these other people who are teaching them other things? Well, he says there are other apostles that are teaching you. So he seems to be in contradiction to some of the other apostles. And you got the Gnostics, you've got all these different groups that claim to be Christianity, but just like Christians today, there's multiples of them. And when we say, oh, we believe the Bible only as far as it's translated correctly, we can go to the earliest texts, and because they were written by hand, they can follow them just like a genealogy tree, and they can say, this copy of the Bible came from this tradition, because we can see that it's got the same changes and the same errors that don't exist in these other Bibles over here. And so we know that because of their beliefs, we can see the changes in this from these, and we can see why they would change them, because they're from this specific belief system. And so they're changing it, trying to make a case stronger for them than these guys are. And when you start tracing that, you can see the groups changing the Bible intentionally to strengthen their own argument or their own
even in modern day English translations of the Bible, there are translations where they choose the wording in the translation because it supports their theology, and they'll change it to be either more Trinitarian or to be more patriarchy based, where women are more subservient, or those kinds of things. Or even
why do we have a JST?
Translations.
Why do we have a JST? Joseph Smith had to put it in the Bible, his philosophy or his theology.
Or Adam Clarke's philosophy.
Or Adam Clarke.
Yeah, certainly Adam Clarke influenced some of that. That's true. All right, so next one. So in biblical scholarship, in part of biblical scholarship that I read a book called The History of the Bible by John Barton. He was an Episcopal priest, and he was a professor at Oxford University, and he was often the lead scholar in the Oxford Study Bible, the translation of the Bible. He wrote a book called A History of the Bible, and he has chapters not only about how the Bible came to be, but he has chapters about how the Bible impacted people socially, culturally, things like that as well. And so one thing as it applied to my faith crisis is I recognize that there are texts in the Bible where I sense spirit with them. But that doesn't mean they're literal or historical. So my number 6 is, just because the texts aren't univocal, it doesn't mean that readers today don't experience a sense of spirit with some scriptural texts. Many do. However, experiences of spirit are subject to fallible and false attributions of meaning. For example, to be interpreted that something is objectively factual or literally historical, that's a false attribution of meaning to a sense of spirit. And an example that I commonly share is the story of the woman taken in adultery. The story of the woman taken in adultery is placed in the Gospel of John. It's a late edition. It wasn't added until centuries later. There's some apologetic scholars that try to argue that it was like omitted and then added back in, but the consensus of scholars is that it was a late edition. And it's a beautiful story for people that understand what the writer was trying to do when they inserted that story. It connects to Jewish festivals where they would get together and they would eat and drink wine and stay in tents, and sometimes not stay in their own tent. And in that particular festival, they would read the words of Jeremiah, and there's some in the words of Jeremiah that express something like that: if you're not faithful or obedient or something like that, worthy to me, that your names won't be worth what's written in the dust. And so they would have read that at that festival. So in the story where this is placed is this festival is happening, and these Jewish leaders bring this woman taken in adultery, probably totally guilty because they were probably doing the same thing because they were drunk, switching tents. They catch the woman in adultery and then challenge Jesus, that like, do we stone her kind of thing. And in the story, Jesus kneels down and starts with his finger writing in the dust, which a Jewish reader, somebody that understood Jewish history and these festivals, would catch the symbolism that Jesus might have been writing their names in the dust, because it connects to the story and the scriptures from Jeremiah that were read at that particular festival. And he says, he who was without sin, let him cast the first stone, and they go away. And then Jesus asks, where are thine accusers? And they're gone. And he asks her to go and sin no more. So it's a beautiful story. And people read that and they experience a sense of spirit, because it's a story of forgiveness. It's a story of Jesus pushing back on the hypocritical people. If they understand the deeper meaning of it, it's this symbolism of Jesus fulfilling or doing what Jehovah would have done, writing these hypocritical Jewish leaders' names in the dust or something like that. But it's a beautiful story, and people can experience a sense of spirit or connection or awe with scriptural texts. But in Mormonism, because of what Joseph Smith believed and what he expressed in the Book of Mormon, the attribution of meaning that we are conditioned to believe is that when we experience spirit, that's a reliable divine witness of the truthfulness of the objective truthfulness of what we're reading. And some of us even believed that what was true wasn't only the principle, but that it had to have happened. The story of the woman in the taken in adultery had to have happened. And if it didn't happen, we wouldn't have felt spirit in it. Some of us actually believed that kind of thing. What do you think?
Yeah. No, I think that's I think that's what they encourage. And I think that's naturally what happens when you need to believe and you want to believe, and everyone around you is believing. You make yourself believe.
Or we believe that a man got swallowed by a whale and lived in its belly for 3 days, something we'd never otherwise believe, but we do, because we learned a lesson from it. It connected with us, therefore it must be true.
Well, and because the writer, one or more of the writers of the Gospels put in Jesus's mouth, Jesus saying that when they see the sign of Jonah of being dead for 3 days and resurrecting, then they'll know that he's the Messiah, kind of thing. So first of all, Jesus wasn't dead for 3 days in all the Gospels, so that's kind of a problem. But Jesus probably knew, the historical Jesus probably knew the story of Jonah. He, like Dan McClellan expressed in his Mormon Stories interview, Jesus, the historical Jesus, probably didn't know that he was going to be crucified. It was probably surprising to him. But these other stories and symbols then got imputed upon him by the writers of the Gospels between 40 and 70 or more years after the historical Jesus died. And one of them is they put in the Jesus saying this, referring to the sign of Jonah. So if people read the Gospels, they sense spirit about Jesus saying the sign of Jonah, then that had to be a literal historical story. And so you got to have a Sunday school lesson about a man living in a fish, and you totally miss what the story's about. The story is a satirical allegory suggesting, pushing back on narratives that God could only care about his chosen people, because Jonah's pissed that God would forgive the heathens if he goes and teaches to them. Like that's a beautiful story, right? A satirical allegory trying to express that. And we have a Sunday school lesson trying to talk about whether a man can live in a fish for 3 days.
No, that's what I mean when I said, when I started to teach my kids the scripture stories from any of the books, is when I started to go, I can't really even make my mouth say these words because it sounds crazy. And I started to come to terms with what I did and didn't believe. And it was when I was trying to share things in family night, with my kids, and just going, they're looking up into my face and they would believe anything I said. And I remembered how I was raised and how I believed everything they said, and I honestly couldn't tell the stories, couldn't say the words. So, and then really started to look at it more critically.
Yeah, I remember a conversation in our local Mormon Spectrum support group, and we had a member of the group that had primary age kids, and he came to one of our meetups once, and he says, I don't know what to do. He said, my son came home from Sunday school and they had taught about the global flood. And he was terrified that God would kill everyone, including his dog.
Yep.
Oh,
You know,
dog,
he's
yeah.
like, what am I supposed to say to him? I'm like, well, what did you, how did you respond? He says, the way I responded is I said, bud, I don't believe in a God that would do that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's what you arrive at. And then you start giving him more information on top of that. So
Oops. Yeah. Yeah. But when you think about these things, and then you read like Third Nephi, is it Third Nephi 7, where the voice of Jesus is like almost bragging about drowning and burning and burying like cities full of people that would have had innocents and puppies, right?
And puppies.
Or whatever their pet was.
Third Nephi is horrifying. I know. I mean,
yeah. All right. So next one. So number 7 slide is the implication of all these things for me, for the framing and understanding of restoration texts, for all intents and purposes, ended my faith crisis 8 years ago, because it gave more reasonable and satisfying answers to my questions about church history and restoration scriptures than the apologists did on difficult issues. So the apologists, try to come up with the catalyst theory, or they try to come up with, Blake Ostler's expansion theory. Like there's an ancient source text and Joseph is receiving revelation, then he's expressing it through his 19th century lens and his fundamentalist literalist view of the Bible, but it still has to be based on an actual ancient historical text. And all the apologetics in between, they don't stand up to just these principles that we're talking about. So you don't have to believe that God drowned puppies, figuratively or literally. And you don't have to believe, like DNC 132, that my 26-year-old daughter's value is as small as being potentially 1 in 1,000 of the wives and concubines, the sex slaves of King Solomon, who in DNC 132 is promoted to be a god, big G, God, not in our current translation, but if you go to Joseph Smith Papers Project, he was a big G God on a throne with his 1,000 wives and concubines, or that women can be taken and reassigned by the keyholder, by Joseph Smith, and women belong to men, and all the spiritual abuse of Emma in DNC 132, those kinds of things. This makes Joseph Smith probably believed, I believe he held a fundamentalist literalist view of biblical text. He believed that Abraham was a real person, not a literary character. He believed Moses was a real person. He believed the 12 tribes of Israel kind of thing. He believed all those things. And my speculation is he quite likely believed that God was okay with having wives and concubines in the Bible. So why not? And so then he expresses a revelation through this framework, including all these horrific things and totally wrong things that don't even correspond with what's in biblical text, and that contradict what's in the Book of Mormon in terms of David and Solomon, or like Isaac. The character of Isaac in the Bible wasn't a polygamist, right? And Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob weren't commanded to be polygamous. That was just a convention of the day of the people who wrote those origin stories, right? That makes way more sense to me than the apologetics. And so then the theologies that developed over time, I ended up reading Charles Harrell's book, This Is My Doctrine, The Development of Mormon Theology, which refers to a lot of this kind of biblical scholarship. But then it's so much easier. It resolved my faith crisis, because I can see that Joseph Smith expressed things, and the leaders of the church from Brigham Young until today, they express things framed through a fundamentalist literalist view, and they don't understand remotely hardly anything of what we've discussed in this episode about biblical text. Like President Nelson still believes that the Abrahamic covenant is like a real thing, and that Abraham was a literal historical person, and his wife literally believes that patriarchal blessings name who you're a literal lineal descendant of characters who are in characters in origin myths, like if our ancestor was America, the tribe of America kind of thing.
That's what's even more terrifying than Joseph Smith believing all this. Current apostles and prophet in this day, with the information that's available and the Bible scholarship, still believe that.
Well, that's what happens when you have church leaders who are not Bible scholars.
Right.
They rely on BYU professors, but the BYU professor must tell them what they want to hear, or the BYU professor won't be a BYU professor anymore. So, we've got lawyers and businessmen running churches, not Bible scholars, so they know nothing of this. And that's why we run the church like a corporation and not using biblical sources because they don't know the Bible.
Yeah. Dan McClellan in his Mormon Stories interview suggested that he thinks that while access to uncorrelated church history caused a wave of faith deconstruction, he thinks that the next wave will come from public access to biblical scholarship, increased public access to biblical scholarship. And while there'll be some, like at least one of my friends who is an amateur apologist that shared that post of mine that you referred to, Rebecca, his name is Austin. While Austin accepts a lot of the things that I've shared, he still finds a way to reconcile that there's some underlying historicity in things, and that restoration texts still need to be like a top-down kind of thing in some way, but maybe filtered through the messiness of Joseph's human fallibility. I can't do that. That doesn't work for me. Like, first of all, the actual doctrines expressed in the texts to me are problematic, like the traditional atonement theology and things like that, or the idea that God kills puppies and drowns and burns and buries cities full of people, or punishes us based on the actions of our parents, or our ancestors up to multiple generations kind of thing. And that instead of us being responsible for our own sins, like the actual theologies are problematic. The theologies in D&C 132 are a problem. Whether or not it's complex, whether or not, even if it got some of the things right, like Isaac not being a polygamist kind of thing, if it got that right, still would be a problem, in my view.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the one thing more dangerous than a Bible, study of the Bible to the LDS is the apologetics to the study of the Bible. Because when I started reading some of the answers, I was going, oh my gosh, these guys have nothing. This doesn't even pass the common sense. And then I'd read, and here's the Bible scholars, and they had the receipts. They could show me, here's how we know this. This is why we know this.
Yeah.
And you'd follow it, and the logic was, oh, I can see that. I'd go to the apologetics, and I'm going, you're just pulling this out of thin air here, because nothing you say even passes the common sense test when I started reading it. And that was one of the things where I just went, okay, I'm leaving the apologetics behind. I'm looking at the scholarship and seeing where it leads me. And obviously I ended up the same place you did when I started doing that.
Yeah. I mean, it still makes scriptural text really interesting. It's like poetry and history and politics and horrific things that we don't have to reconcile, whether or not, God told the Israelites to go murder all of the Midianites, but keep the virgin daughters as sex slaves. Like, we don't have to reconcile that as having anything to do with God.
Yep.
That was written by men, most likely not women. It was written by men who were trying to make political, philosophical claims and claims to land and ownership and rights and all those kinds of things. that's what that's about. That God has nothing. There is no God worthy of worship that would have anything to do with that.
The one faith promoting part of the Old Testament is I realized God was always a real estate God, even back in the Old Testament time. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nothing's changed.
All right. So
Nothing at all.
I've got one last slide here to share, and that is some sources.
Oh, good.
So some introductory sources, and there's just so many. But if people are going to start going down this rabbit hole of biblical scholarship and religious history, I recommend This Is My Doctrine, The Development of Mormon Theology by Dr. Charles Harrell. He was a BYU professor when he wrote this. He didn't get excommunicated for it. I think it's it's long and things like that, but the information in it is just absolutely fabulous. The first Bart Ehrman book that I read was Misquoting Jesus. But I also read a whole host of other ones: How Jesus Became God, The Jesus Before the Gospels, Forged, Jesus Interrupted, and others. He wrote a book called The Triumph of Christianity that was very interesting to me. Dr. Dan McClellan, the first book that he recommends people read if they're interested in biblical scholarship is this book by Dr. John Barton called A History of the Bible. It's available. Both Misquoting Jesus and A History of the Bible are available on Audible. So you can listen to them. You can get them in Kindle. You can get them in paperback. The next book is not a biblical scholarship book, but it provides context to a religious history. It's called God, A Human History by Reza Aslan. He's the one who also wrote Zealot.
Yeah.
So it's a book about religious history and the development of how human beings create gods, when and how monotheism was developed, and then how he reconciles where progressive faith traditions end up. And he suggests that progressive faith traditions end up in what's called pantheism, which is an idea that divinity exists universally. It's omnipresent. We're a part of it. And that fits like progressive Islam. It fits a lot of progressive Christianity as well, and some progressive Mormons even. The next one is there are different Bibles. I really like the Society of Biblical Literature, the SBL Study Bible. It's a revised edition of the HarperCollins Study Bible. I also like the New Oxford Annotated Study Bible as well. There's a translation that you can get on Amazon too called the Robert Alter translation. So it's a contemporary translation of what we would call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible by a Jewish scholar, with a lot of really great commentary in it. Mormons can read Thomas Waymont's translation of the New Testament as well, but that might be stretching for a lot of people because, like, he'll acknowledge that Paul didn't write Hebrews, for example. One thing, like Landon, you referred to that you can sign up for Yale's courses, but there's actually Yale's courses has a YouTube channel, and all the lectures for RLST 145, which is an Introduction to Old Testament college course with Dr. Christine Hayes, is on YouTube.
Yeah, that's the one I took. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh.
I learned more in the first episode
Me too.
than I did in my lifetime in the church, including attending Seminary Institute and BYU Religion.
And there's one on the New Testament, and it's good too. So
yeah, fantastic. And then Dr. Dan McClellan has been recognized with a significant award by the Society of Biblical Literature. It's the largest and oldest association of biblical scholars. I think there are more than 7,000 members, probably more than that, but I think there's at least 7,000 members. And they gave him an award for increasing public access to biblical scholarship. And so Dr. Dan McClellan has a TikTok channel at McClellan, McLelan on TikTok. He also, you can find his content on other social media platforms, as well as on the Data Over Dogma podcast. And he has a new book that is published that is going to be released in April. So
we're excited about that. We're keeping an eye on that for sure for the Good Book Club. So
and I give a shout out to Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Friedman.
Absolutely.
Very easy for those people who are less academically inclined, like myself, who can just like to have it laid out in layman's terms. He does a very good job of doing that.
Yeah, that was that was actually the first. No, that was the second Old Testament related one. David Bakaboy's
I read
book.
his second. I read,
But and I mentioned earlier in the episode, Rob Bell wrote a book called "What Is the Bible?" That I thought was really great. He has other books like Love Wins, and I think Velvet Elvis is another one. He's wrote a number of books that relate to the difference between what biblical texts actually were intended to be and what they say, and what basically what we would call Christian nationalism or evangelical Christianity tends to try to impute to biblical texts. So there are a lot of great sources. Between Landon and I, we could probably give you a book list of 30 as a starter.
I feel like we should add some more to the show notes because we keep mentioning things. And I think the point is in the past, I don't think there were so many accessible, outlets to study this. And I feel like somebody like Dan McClellan that just makes it, anyone can start to learn. Anybody can kind of have their brain broken open just a little bit by a couple of his TikToks, get interested, move into some of these other books. We read Zealot in the Good Book Club, and it blew our minds. I mean, and we considered ourselves fairly well read and well studied, and we read that. We're like, whoa, it just takes a second to just crack that open a little bit. And then, like you say, you can't unsee it, and then you want to see more. So I just think we're really lucky to have so many people now that are making it accessible, because I think you're absolutely right. The key to understanding Mormonism and all of our text is the original text. A Bible. You got to read your Bible.
And I guess I'm repeating myself, but these are some of the reasons that it resolved my faith crisis, because then it wasn't a question anymore. And then actually studying church history and restoration texts and biblical texts actually became more interested to me, because I wasn't trying to make them something that they weren't. I was just accepting them for what they were in the context of when they were created, and through the philosophical, rhetorical, and theological goals, biases, and views of the creator of the text, Joseph Smith.
Yep, that's it. The first time I ever started thinking about that concept was Steve Pinecker, who is an evangelical, and he mentioned a couple years ago, the evangelical community has an appreciation for the Book of Mormon because that's where all of our sermons are from back in the day. You can read the text and you can recognize some of those sermons that weren't written down, that are lost, but they're in the Book of Mormon. And that made me start thinking, wow, it really is the 19th century. There it is, to the point where these people looking from the outside in recognize things from their own theological history there in the sermons that are kind of reconstituted there in the Book of Mormon. Like you said, the infant baptism, or, whatever it is. So I thought that was very interesting. And once you start thinking about it along those lines, you can't unthink that. And then you start seeing everything in those terms.
Yeah. And you think about, when you place it in that historical context, you think like we had a brand new country, 1776, right? The Revolutionary War of 1812, brand new country. There weren't like local governments and everything all set up. It was just like, it was new, And so the Freemasons were a lot of the structure of how townships and things were put together. And there was folklore magic, and there was a very anti-Catholic rhetoric. And then there were things that happened with the Freemasons that, conspiracy theories aren't just for our day. They were about their day too. and the William Morgan affair.
Oh.
I mean, it wasn't an affair, but basically, supposedly they killed him because he
Scenario,
was
yeah.
doing. But Joseph Smith married his widow. That was like his second or third wife, Lucinda
Yep.
Morgan.
Yeah.
Early one.
So, in any event, you place it in context with all the kind of the craziness that was happening, and like Steve indicated that some of the theology and the sermons of that day, like they're preserved in the Book of Mormon. So, in any event, a lot of people go through faith crisis like, I don't want to spend any time on that anymore. But I'm curious about that stuff now. So.
Yeah. No, I think it's really important. And I've even talked to people who have had the faith crisis based on the treatment of people. You know what I mean? They looked into the church and they've seen the treatment of people. And that's what finally said, I can't be part of it. And they ask me, why are you so fixated on the history and the origins? And I'm like, because that allows you to recognize and say, I can fully step away. I don't have to try to get on board with any of that kind of treatment. I don't have to do any of it because the history and all the scholarship doesn't back it up. And sometimes people will come back to me and they'll go, oh, I started studying. I see what you mean now, and I'm much more at peace with it, because when you step away over treatment of people, you still have the side of you that thinks, well, it's true, but I just can't anymore because of this. Once you deconstruct all of it and you have the understanding of not just the Book of Mormon, not just the D&C, back to the New Testament, back to the Old Testament, it all fits together so logically, then you can just fully kind of go, okay, unless you continue to podcast about it, then you have to still talk about it, but you still mentally have gone, all right,
you can't, you can leave it, but you can't leave it alone.
Exactly. But it's so comforting to have it nicely tied up in a bow in your mind. I think that hopefully a lot of us get there at some point. So
right. For sure.
Yeah, I think it's good. Landon, do you have any final thoughts? This has been so good. I knew it would be, but I'm always like, it's still so good.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I started my study of the Old Testament and the New Testament and joined those Yale online courses when I was active, when I was believing, because I wanted to better understand Jesus's time and the times and the teachings of the people from that actual time period. And once I got into it, that's when the nut started to crack and I started to say, this is not what I have been told all my life. But the more I read, the more fascinated I became and the more I appreciated the Bible for what it really is. There's a reason it's the most read book and the oldest book, that we have, and the most influential book, because it's full of human intrigue. It's full of how people manipulate other people, how people find religion in things that maybe didn't start out religious, how religion transforms over time. There's just so many lessons to be learned from it. And I learned those lessons, but unfortunately, as I learned, they weren't the same lessons I was learning in Mormonism. And once I understood it, I just couldn't turn back. It was too obvious that when the Old Testament falls apart, all of the Reformation scripture falls apart with it.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of Christianity that can function with nuance, even if a lot of the Old Testament isn't historical, particularly the Pentateuch, the 5 books attributed to Moses. But in Mormonism, it's so enmeshed, it's so integrated into the theology and into restoration scriptures that I have believing friends and apologists that think I'm overstating how much the restoration relies on the literal historicity of the Pentateuch, of
I don't think so.
The book of Daniel being prophecy.
Moses
Isaiah.
showed up and gave him keys. How he
if there's no Moses, exactly. Do the math.
If Moses is a literary character, that's a problem. If Melchizedek is a literary character based on who the king of Sodom was, not Salem, and Abraham is a literary character, so he wouldn't have paid tithing to the king of Sodom. that's weird to name a priesthood after a literary character.
Yeah.
Like I don't know how my believing friends that understand some of this stuff can reconcile it, because it just doesn't make any
Yeah.
sense.
The book
to
of
me.
Abraham was written by the hand of Abraham.
That's what it says.
Abraham couldn't have written something if he didn't exist.
Didn't have a hand. That's right. That's something I'm always surprised. There's so many people, it seems like, going to divinity school. Have you noticed that, Landon?
Yeah, we've
Faithful
seen that
LDS?
a lot. A
I'm
lot
just
of
thinking,
LDS people going to divinity
how do
school.
you learn all that and not take a second look at things? Maybe I don't know what they teach at a divinity school, but
Yeah, I mean, that might
lots of
be a
people.
discussion for another episode, but
Yeah.
no, I'm not going to spoil the heretic, but
Yeah.
there seems to be a post-secular spirituality
Hmm.
that exists, where people who accept a lot of the things that we've been talking about, and they are still interested in symbolism and spirituality
Mhm.
without the literalism. And I think Richard Rohr does that, and Brian McLaren, and
Mhm.
I think Rachel Held Evans did that in Evangelical Christianity, and Rob Bell certainly does that. So there's like a post-secular spiritual practice that without the literalism. But I did a podcast episode with a nuanced believing member, and he asked a question about, if you don't have literalism, then you have nothing, right? Like Landon mentioned, if there's not a literal fall, there's not a literal need for an atonement. And my answer to this friend was, I think for people who are ingrained with the idea of a traditional atonement theology, that ultimately we're fallen, that we're separated from God, that we have this transactional relationship with God where we've sinned, and so we need to repent, like we need to, like Stephen Robinson, we need to give all the money we have to buy the bicycle, and then Jesus will take the balance of the transaction. For people who have a concept or a sense of identity based on a traditional atonement theology, that we're constantly needing to repent, that we have this transactional relationship with God, and justice and mercy have to be satisfied, they need literalism, because without literalism, then the transaction isn't satisfied. And so my answer to him is, as long as people are stuck in that traditional atonement theology, where there has to be justice and mercy and a transaction and a blood sacrifice, they're going to do everything they can to not let go of literalism, because that's the only way that concept can be satisfied. And if they can shift to another attribution of meaning to atonement that's not a transactional relationship with God, maybe it's like Reza Aslan's, or Richard Rohr, panentheism instead of pantheism, where this idea that we can't really be separated from God because God is omnipresent and we're a part of it. Like we are to God like bees are to a beehive, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And if they shift an idea of atonement theology, that we are shedding dysfunction to discover the divinity that's already inside of us that we're a part of, then maybe they can let go of literalism. And at least that's my theory. I think I'm interested in exploring that more. I just don't know how people who hold traditional atonement theologies can let go of literalism, because they need the transaction to be satisfied, is my take.
Yeah. No, and that's problematic. Looking at it from the outside, but then I'm not a person that needs it to work. So I'm not trying very hard to make it work.
Yeah, right.
I kind of have the opposite. What is the most logical thing? Oh, it's this.
Yeah. There you go.
Which is an easy way to do it. That's right.
All right. We're not going to call you Sister Paxton today, then.
No, don't call me Sister Paxton. That's right. No, your review was, if you guys haven't checked out Anthony's review of Heretic, he's written a bunch of stuff on it and really, really provocative ideas. So I finally went back and thought this a second time, just alone by myself, because I told everybody the first time I was like just so overwhelmed by the idea of missionaries. I have a missionary out, it's that kind of thing, like, but the second time through, everybody said, take a notebook, because the second time through, you'll be in a state where you can, really write down some ideas. So,
for sure.
No, it's fascinating. If you haven't seen it yet, we won't give any spoilers. Go see it. Let us know what you think. So, well, all right. Well, oh my gosh, thank you. This has been absolutely amazing. Please, everybody, comment. Let us know what you think. There was a lot to unpack here. Are you guys a fan of the Bible? Have you read the Old Testament, studied the New Testament, and how do you feel it relates in your little microcosm to the scriptures of the Restoration? It is a really fascinating rabbit hole to go down, and there's lots of different twists and turns and things that you can arrive at, but we love Anthony's take on it, as we always do on everything. So please comment and let us know what you think. Please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast. And if you'd like to be made aware of when new episodes come out, you can hit that notification bell. If you would like to financially help make a donation to Mormonish Podcast, it is the end of the year. Tithing declaration. If you're not going to that and you're looking for a place to put your donation, we are a 501c3. So we just absolutely appreciate everybody that does donate to the podcast. We also have links in the show notes, not only to Donor Box, where it's easy to make a one-time or monthly donation. We have links to our merch store. You can pick up a Mormonish mug or a hat or a sweatshirt or get your Mormonish on. And again, just thank you so much to Landon for co-hosting. And thank you for Anthony for being one of our very favorite guests that we'd love to have on. And we'll see all you guys next time on Mormonish. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.